1. First, some background. I grew up in the densest region of the biggest city in South America. It's a dangerous place, to the point where I had never met a single adult person who wasn't robbed at least a few times. You know the story that in some places there are a lot of words to describe snow, because of how prevalent it is? Well, in Brazil, there are many words to describe robbery. One particularly common type of robbery is called arrastão, literally a great dragging. It's when a group of robbers target individuals in a much larger crowd. The sudden scare makes those near the attack run away, and when people see others coming, scared and screaming, they also start running along, dragging the whole crowd in a single direction, hence the name. The robbers use the ensuing chaos to flee before the cops are called, though it is usually a very brief event. Usually. Back in 2009, I used to travel by subway and walk for about 10 minutes the rest of the way to college. I studied at night and classes finished at 11:15 p.m., by which time I would take a bus to return to the subway station, because it would be too dangerous to walk this late at night. On November 10th, around 10 p.m., I was in the class when I noticed all the lights in the building I could see through the window turn off, and soon after the lights in my building would go off as well. I didn't know it at the time, but what happened was a huge blackout that affected half of Brazil, and the entirety of Paraguay for a while. Power would gradually return, but things would only be normal the next day, almost 8 hours later. Anyway, the generator kicked in, but our teacher dismissed the class because of the blackout. As I left, I discovered near total darkness outside. Streets were almost illuminated by the cars on the road. I went to the crowded bus stop and waited. My bus arrived very late, but eventually I reached the subway, and this is when things start to go very wrong. Because of the blackout, the subway was not operational, and there was already a very large crowd waiting for it to reopen. The building itself was powered by generators, but no one was allowed past the turnstiles until things got back to normal. This was a very warm Brazilian spring night. There was no ventilation in the building, and the conglomeration caused it to feel even warmer. The result of this is that the crowd was divided in two, one group waiting inside the hot but lightened building, and another waiting outside in the cooler but dark night. By this point, you might have already guessed what happens. I was in the group that chose to bake instead of stand in the dark, but the larger group was outside. Suddenly, I heard a few screams and people started to push and squeeze inside. This made the heat almost unbearable. But soon after the commotion started, it stopped, everything got quiet, and the crowd dispersed a little. Then it happened again. A few screams. Everyone starts to push everyone else inside. Sudden quietness. Unbearable heat. Crowd dispersing again. This kept happening, I'm not sure how many times. I was equal parts scared and confused. I had no idea what was going on, but I overheard people talking and put the pieces together. I was already familiar with the fact this region had a lot of beggars by day turned muggers by night. They usually act alone or in small groups, threatening people with shivs and small knives, or snatching phones from distracted victims. During the blackout, however, they took advantage of the large crowd and practiced the aforementioned arrastão. What made this unusual is the fact that the crowd could not disperse, because we were waiting for the subway. No one would venture far during a blackout, and no cops would ever arrive. So it kept happening over and over again. I'm not sure if they were simply snatching phones, using knives, or both, but whatever it was, it scared those outside repeatedly. I eventually managed to call my father and asked him to drive me home. I was almost more scared when I had to walk alone the short distance to where he had parked the car than I was of the whole ordeal. I was lucky to have someone to drive me home, because as it turns out, the subway would remain closed for a few more hours. I can't imagine having to deal with that situation for long. I still remember seeing an old lady waiting alone on a secluded bus stop, in near complete darkness during my drive home. She was probably even more scared than I was that night. Hard to even imagine. I also hope those opportunistic robbers got what they deserved in the end, but knowing Brazil, I highly doubt it. 2. This happened 20 years ago in the summer of 2000. I was getting ready to start my junior year of college in September, living off campus in an apartment, one of 4 units in a small wood house. My old roommates had graduated that year and had just recently moved out. I had found one new roommate, and he and I were looking for a third. One day around noon, a guy about our age stops by to look at the room. It's not much to look at, being a garden-level apartment that doesn't get a lot of light. However, being a local DJ, he says he doesn't mind too much. He comically says he's used to darker spaces. He gets real interested when I tell him the former tenant also had a full drum kit and played at all hours without any complaint from the neighbors. We chat a bit more before he leaves to check out some other spots, but says he's interested and would give me a call tomorrow. He seemed nice, and I could see it working out. I leave for work not long after he's gone, bartending at the time. I work the closing shift and get back home around 1 a.m. It's late, but my other roommate has been out of town for most of the week and getting back tomorrow, so I stay up for a couple more hours to watch TV and enjoy the last night of having the entire place to myself. The next morning, when I hear the beeping of my alarm around 8:30, there's no way I'm getting up. I was scheduled for another closing shift at the bar and had decided to get some errands done in the morning before going into work. But on 5 hours of sleep, it was not happening. I reach over to give the alarm a smack to turn it off, except the beeping doesn't stop. I blindly hit it a few more times with no luck, then finally sit up, intent on murdering this clock. In my waking haze, I finally realize it's not the clock, and that the beeping is coming from outside the room. What the hell is that, I think, also noticing an odd glow coming from the small crack below my bedroom door. My bedroom is the only one on the first floor next to the living room, the other 2 at that garden level. So when I open my door to see what's beeping, I have line of sight to the front door, which is engulfed in a roaring fire. A fire that's also started to spread into the apartment, which is entirely furnished by wonderfully affordable but also highly flammable junk from the Salvation Army. Dark acrid smoke is starting to pull across the ceiling. There's a small funny part to this story, and I swear to God the universe this is true. On seeing this, I actually went, "Oh my," and then just slowly, quietly closed my bedroom door. That's not me being brave. Having just woken up, I think I needed a moment to process that what was happening wasn't a dream. But perhaps I could open the door again and try for a different result. After standing there a few seconds in disbelief, the black smoke seeping into my room, and the smell accompanying it brought me to my senses with a loud, "Oh shit!" I threw on some pants and sneakers before bursting out of my bedroom window that faced the back of the building, thankfully not yet touched by the fire, and climbed down to safety. I joined a saint of a passerby who was already breaking the windows of the other units and shouting to my neighbors inside they needed to get out. We get all 3 of my neighbors out as the fire department arrives. Fortunately, no one was killed. The people in the upstairs units had left for work by the time the fire started. Otherwise, it could have been much worse. By the time the fire department arrived, it had already consumed the entire front of the building where the stairs were, leaving no other way down for them had they been home but a long jump. The rest of the day is a blur, of the police taking our statements, the media asking for interviews and quotes. I hear from one of the witnesses also making a statement that while she was driving by, she noticed a man standing just outside the door to my unit, just staring at a fire that was quickly getting out of control. She immediately pulled over and shouted at him, and he took off running without even turning around. The fire is eventually ruled an arson. While they're unsure of what started it, most likely it was a lit cigarette in a trash can right outside my door. I crashed with a friend in town for a couple of weeks, before deciding I need some time away from all this, quitting my job and heading off to stay with other friends, a couple states away for the rest of the summer. The internet being garbage back then, and mobile phones barely a common thing, I lose track of the news. I hear a bit from a friend in town that someone was arrested for setting fire to a construction site only a few blocks from my old place, but they're not sure it's connected. When I get back into town 2 months later to start school, I check in with the old neighbors and with the landlord. He's been following this story of the neighborhood fire starter pretty closely. Someone was in fact arrested for setting fire to a construction site, and this person was connected to another attempted arson only blocks away. If I remember the news articles well enough, they never connected this person to our building's fire, but they were suspected of starting several other fires in the vicinity. As we're going through the newspaper clippings, we get to the most recent ones, and I gasp. There in his new mugshot is my one-time potential DJ roommate. I did end up going to the police with this information and made a formal statement, but they took me aside to explain they already got the guy, that my statement wouldn't add much to establishing his intent, and since they never recovered any usable forensic evidence or better witnesses from my building, his defense could likely chalk it up to a hell of a coincidence. Maybe so, or maybe they just considered the case closed. Frankly, since no one died, with school starting up, and being fairly convinced it was the same guy and knowing he was now off the streets, I don't mind letting it go as well. There were no more arsons in town after that, at least none around our old neighborhood. So, part-time DJ and full-time arsonist, you're likely out of prison by now. I hope you're a better person for serving that time, but let's not meet. P.S. Check your fire alarms. 3. I've never really told this story, at least not completely, but it's something that I still think about from time to time. It kind of haunts me. I used to work as a manager at a fast food place in a rather seedy part of a medium-sized city. I worked at the nicer location until they decided to transfer me, and there were rumors that this location I ended up getting sent to was going to be shut down, which did end up happening a few years after I finally left. Anyway, the point is that the place wasn't being well taken care of. The dining room was dated and old, and the owners were certainly not updating or maintaining the place well. They were just barely maintaining the very basic safety requirements, and sometimes they weren't at all. For example, I often worked the closing shift, which for this location at the time was 4 p.m. to midnight. Between 7 p.m. and 11 p.m., it was me running the drive-thru and front counter by myself, and one employee running the kitchen. At 11 p.m., that other employee would go home, and I was left by myself to tidy up and do the deposit between 11 p.m. and 12 p.m. This isn't really safe, and I'm not sure it was even entirely illegal at the time. This was over a decade ago, so who knows? Just to provide a little context and background here, I'm a girl, but I'm not what you would consider small. I'm 6 feet, and during this time, I think people would probably say I came across as more than a little stern. I was younger, but I'd already spent years working in fast food, getting treated like crap by customers and having drinks and food thrown at me. The location I worked at was a swarm with junkies and drug dealers, and just general scary behavior. All this to say, I didn't get ruffled that easily, and I took a lot of things in stride. However, on this night, I was working the night shift with a new guy. The new guy had probably been working there for no more than a few weeks. I'd worked with him a few times before, but never the closing shift. And from the first time I'd met him, I'd always gotten a strange vibe from him. And again, I'm not someone who at the time got ruffled easily. Prior to this, I had worked with a night janitor at the other location, who'd had an Adderall addiction and rather unpredictable and scary rage problem. And some creepy incel kid who barely spoke more than 2 words at a time. And when he did, it was always something about how much he disliked women, and me in particular. Not an exaggeration. But this guy, this new dude, he was a whole different level of weird. He had a kid and professed to be a single father. He'd brought the kid around during the day, and the kid and his clothing were always really dirty, like really dirty. And not only that, but the kid also occasionally had bruises on his head and arms. The kid was a toddler, and I know that toddlers can get into things, but one look at that kid, and I knew that those bruises were not from just a little kid messing around. I never saw the new guy behave aggressively towards his kid at all, but I don't know. It was just a feeling. And that feeling translated into other things. I don't know, it was just creepy. It wasn't one thing in particular, it was just a feeling I got when I was around him. He was a medium-height, stocky young guy. He was totally average in every way, but he just had a vibe about him. He was always friendly, never rude or aggressive, but his eyes were just lifeless, for lack of a better descriptor. Anyway, on this night, I think he might have been called in over a shift for someone else. I was in charge of making the schedules most of the time, and I am pretty sure I wouldn't have scheduled him to work at closing with me, since I found him so off-putting. The first part of the night was fairly normal. I ran the drive-thru in the front counter, and he ran the kitchen between 8 and 11 p.m. He was talking to me on and off between orders, telling me about his ex and how he'd come to be a single father. Apparently, the mother of his child had a drug problem. In hindsight, I think a lot of what he said was meant to inspire sympathy. He really laid the troubled tale of him and his son on thick, but at the time, I just felt a little bad for both of them, especially his kid, who I suspected was being abused, but despite being seen as stern, I was definitely still young and naive when it came to manipulative people. He told me that he'd moved to the city and immediately had trouble finding work prior to getting the job at the place we worked at. He said he'd been running out of money and was behind on rent, bills, and didn't have any formula for his son. At the time, I think I just empathized with him and said that sucked. We were both working in fast food, and I thought it was obvious that neither of us had any money. The place was bare-bones minimum wage, and I was barely getting by with 3 roommates, and only pretty much eating the free meal I was given from the restaurant every day. Anyway, he laid it on thick all night, and I don't know that I was really paying all that much attention to it. People tended to ramble when working the late shift, and I had gotten used to listening to people spontaneously talk about their personal problems. I had a habit of just listening and not really reciprocating the sharing, and I guess this didn't really go over well with the new guy. At some point, the new guy said something to the effect of, "You don't talk much, do you? I'm telling you my whole life story here, and you got nothing to say?" I don't know if it was just that I was coming across unsympathetic, or more likely, that he was frustrated that he wasn't successfully manipulating me into giving up personal details about myself. As far as I was concerned, he was just someone I was working with, and I didn't know him. I didn't really want him to know me, and I certainly wasn't about to start telling him anything that wasn't surface-level chit-chat. But the guy was really intimidating. Something about his tone was off. It definitely wasn't a jokey accusation or off-the-cuff comment. I can't remember exactly what I said, but I remember that I just tried to play it off somehow. He didn't say anything more about it, but after that the silence between us seemed a little tense. At 11 p.m. it was time for him to go home. The normal procedure was that the kitchen closer would tidy their area, and an actual kitchen cleaner would come in a few hours later to deep clean things. In our case, it was a husband and wife team who did several locations, but they didn't usually come in until a few hours after I left. So this guy was only tasked with a basic tidy, and then I would let him out, after which I would stay behind and prepare the deposit. But instead of this happening smoothly, this guy goes into the staff bathroom and stays there for a long while, like almost 20 minutes or something. I did not know what was going on, nor did I know exactly how to handle the situation. It had honestly never happened before. People usually could not get out of there fast enough at the end of the night. Was he sick? Did he fall asleep? I didn't know, but I honestly just wanted to get my work done and go home. He finally emerged and quickly walked to the door and left. I was relieved. It was weird, but I just shrugged it off and hurried back to the office to get done what I needed to get done. Not 10 minutes later, I start to hear a banging at the back door of the restaurant. Loud, repeated banging. Normally I would ignore this. The back door faced an alley and was right next to a street full of bars and pubs. People leaving the bars and pubs often got the idea that banging on the door would get them after-hours food service, because, well, they were drunk. So this wasn't necessarily uncommon. So I just ignored it and kept hurrying to get things done. But the banging did not stop, and it somehow just seemed to get louder and louder and more urgent. So I finally got up and went to look out the peephole to see who was there. At this point I was definitely on edge, and this edginess swelled into full-out anxiety attack when I see that it's a new guy standing at the back door. Now, my first thought was not to open the door. I really didn't want to open the door, but I knew that he knew that I was in there. What if he forgot something inside? What if it was his house keys, car keys, or something? I was going to have to leave the building by that same door at some point, so there really seemed to be no escaping him. So reluctantly and very stupidly, yet trust me, I know, I opened the door. What I opened the door to was quite frankly terrifying to me. He said he left his jacket or his keys, maybe, I can't remember, inside, and I told him to tell me where and I'd go get them. I didn't want him to come inside. If this had been any other person I worked with regularly, this would be no big deal. I'd let them back in, let them get whatever they left behind, and they'd take off. But I instinctively knew I didn't want this dude back inside in the dark, empty restaurant with me. But new dude was not having it. He pushed past me and said he'd get it himself. Then he proceeded to shut himself in the bathroom again. And at this point, I just panicked. Instead of just staying there by the door, which in hindsight I should have, I rushed back to the office. Stupid girl, that's me, had left some of the cash I was counting for the deposit out. Question: what dummy would answer the back door at night at all? And especially with the till out? Well, this girl, I guess. This dumb girl. I managed to stuff the cash in the safe and lock it before he came to find me. The office was dark. It was summer and the air conditioning was on full blast, but this dude was sweating a lot. I was taller than him, and I'm not a small girl, but somehow I just knew that this guy was about to hurt me. He was all keyed up. As I watched his eyes dart around the office, I grabbed my jacket hanging on the hook next to me. I hadn't finished my deposit, but I was getting out of there. I didn't care how much shit I got into in the morning for my work not being done. I smiled and told him that I was just leaving, and that he could walk me out. I was really just trying not to show my panic. Whatever he had planned, I wanted to give him an out, for him to rethink it. So I smiled, grabbed my purse, and started to move towards the door. New guy who was standing in the doorway did not budge, though. He started talking, though, about his son, about the money trouble he'd been having, and capped the whole story off with a request for a loan. From the tone of his voice, it was clear this was not a loan. He was demanding money from me. He said he would pay me back as soon as he got paid, and that I'd really be helping him out. I didn't know what to do. He had me trapped. I wasn't leaving the office or the building unless he allowed it. Or at this point, at least, I wasn't leaving without a fight. Something told me that despite my height difference, I wasn't going to win. So I gave him money from my wallet, $50, I think. When I gave it to him, he said, "Thanks. You're really helping me and my son out. I won't forget it." But when he said it, he had no expression, no smile, no speech effect at all. He didn't seem grateful or even relieved, just dead eyes, arms limp at his sides. It was terrifying. To this day, I don't remember how I got him to the door. All I remember was shutting the door behind him, making sure the door was securely locked, and rushing into the office to burst into tears. I didn't finish my work, but I stayed in there until I could force myself to leave out of the same door. I was sure he was going to jump me when I left. The thought never occurred to me to call the cops. I don't know why. I guess I just felt like nothing serious had happened yet. He'd asked me for money, and I'd willingly given it to him, despite the fact that I had no choice and had been scared shitless. I only saw him one more time after that, but neither of us mentioned that night or the money. I don't know why I didn't ask for it back. I think I was embarrassed or scared, or both. I don't know. I don't think I've ever told anyone in my life this story, or at least, if I have, I definitely left out the part where I gave him money and never got it back. Pretty quickly after that, he stopped showing up to his shifts, and I never saw him again. I don't believe in throwing words like psychopath around. I think people overuse psychological terms like that, making them just synonymous with anyone who is just horribly behaved. And there are a lot of varying degrees of terribly behaved people in this world, unfortunately. But after taking a lot of abnormal psych classes, I can say that there was definitely something about this guy's effect that was just wrong, for lack of a better term. I'd smile, he'd smile, I'd frown, he'd frown. It was almost like talking to someone pantomiming emotions. Maybe I'm just remembering it that way because it was such a terrifying experience for me. But the truth is that I've never been comfortable talking about this event. And to this day, when I do think about it, I just feel as uncomfortable as I did the day it happened more than a decade ago. So to the new guy, let's never meet again. P.S. The head manager at my restaurant did make an anonymous call to child services about the guy's kid. Unrelated to my incident, obviously. I don't know what, if anything, came of that. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 473. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. And also thank you very much to everybody who joined me for the stream on Sunday. It was quite a fun one. Did I have an announcement? Oh yes, I did have an announcement. In case I forgot to do it, yeah, okay, I'll do it here. I do have a new merchandise store for the Hellfreezer channel. It is now up on Teespring. You can find the link if you go to the channel page, and if you look at the top where all the links are, you know, you've got the Twitter, the Patreon and all that. There's a little icon there that takes you to the Hellfreezer merch store. It used to be Redbubble, but I was never quite happy with it. And this was a perfect chance just to give the Hellfreezer merchandise a bit of an overhaul. I ditched some designs I wasn't 100% happy with. So they're gone, won't be selling them again. And the newer ones, better designs, and I'm much happier with them as well. And I've got some ideas for newer things that are going up as also. Basically what it boils down to is I wasn't very happy with the revenue split that Redbubble had. Not that I'd ever actually made anything off it until recently, because I thought to myself, hang on, I've sold a few things on there. I don't think I've made a lot, but we'll see what it is. And it turned out it was less than £30 in all the years I've had that store. Because I don't promote it. It's part of my fault. So I'll promote the new one because I'm happier with the new one. And turned out that for some reason they had my payment information wrong, even though I looked and it wasn't. So I switched it to PayPal, and eventually I got the money off them there. But I'm not going to shut it down right now, but I probably will shut the Redbubble side of things down at some point. I mean, I found them useful in the past for printing up t-shirts just for myself for my own personal use. But yeah, as far as supporting merchandise requirements on this channel, I think Teespring might be a better option. We'll see how it works out. Okay, and with that, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.